I am honored to have been asked to moderate this panel of distinguished authors around such an important and timely topic, the subject of social justice. I will begin by briefly introducing our panelists, and my introduction will be brief only because I want to make sure to leave enough time for conversation. I will ask a few questions designed to provoke conversation among our panelists, and we'll leave time at the end for questions from the audience. So then let me begin with the introductions. Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, the author of Friday Black. Nana was selected by Colson Whitehead as one of the National Book Foundation's 5 under 3 honorees. Friday Black is his first book. He is the winner of the Penn Gene Stein Book Award and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Award for Best First Book and the Aspen Words Literary Prize. Friday Black was also longlisted for the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. David Blight, the author of Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. David Blight is a professor of American history and director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. His book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, won the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in History and was named one of the best books of 2018 by the New York Times Book Review, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, San Francisco Chronicle, and Time Magazine. Is there anything left out there? I don't know. Author or editor of a dozen books, he has also been awarded the Bancroft Prize, the Abraham Lincoln Prize, and the Frederick Douglass Prize. Judge Richard Gergel, the author of Unexampled Courage, The Blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard, and The Awakening of President Harry S. Truman and Judge J. Waites Waring. Richard Gergel is a federal judge of the United States District Court for the District of South Carolina and a South Carolina lawyer. He presides in the same courthouse in Charleston, South Carolina, where Judge Waring, one of the judges featured in Unexampled Courage, also served. With his wife, Dr. Belinda Gergel, he co-authored In Pursuit of the Tree of Life, A History of the Early Jews of Columbia, South Carolina. Judge Gergel earned undergraduate and law degrees from Duke University. So let me begin with an open-ended question. These 3 books focus on 3 different historical periods. Frederick Douglass's life spans the 19th century. Unexampled Courage is set in the mid-20th century, and Friday Black is steeped in the tensions and conflicts of the present moment and looks toward the future. I'd like to ask each of you to talk for a moment about what attracted you to your subjects.
I can start. First off, thank you for having me, Martha's Vineyard. It's my first time here. I'm happy to be here. Yeah. Yeah, it's different for me, but yeah, very cool. I think the word attract is interesting. I often kind of sort of feel like if I could write about something else, I would. With my fiction, it's sort of the things that I can't stop thinking about, the stories that sort of kind of persist in my mind, even when I'm sort of trying to just, shop at ShopRite or whatever. Mm-hmm. Those are kind of the things that end up sort of coming into my fiction, whether I sort of choose them or not. And I've been thinking about this a lot because people ask me why do you write political stories? And on one side I kind of feel like if the house is on fire, I'm not going to write about what's in the fridge, But also it just seems that this is what is around me. So for me, it's a sort of kind of is the most natural and like sort of kind of the only thing I kind of can do, really.
Well, I want to say thank you to the Vineyard Book Fest for having me and all of us. What a great place and what a great book festival. To be simple about it, what attracted me to Douglas was his importance. But it first happened when I was a high school teacher. I don't have any memory of learning anything about Douglas in high school, which in part reflects how old I am. But I first encountered Douglas, I believe, in college. I took the first ever Black History course taught at Michigan State in about 1968 or 69. And I know we read something by him then, but then I was a high school teacher for 7 years in the 1970s, and we were teaching pieces of Douglas. Didn't know what we were doing, but we were teaching it. And it was in graduate school that Douglas started to inhabit my mind, and my first book was on Douglas. It was my dissertation. It's much smaller than this one. And I've written 6, 7 other books, and Douglas is some piece of some sort in every one of them. At least he's all over the index in all of them. But it was only because I encountered an extraordinary collection, private collection of Douglas manuscripts about 12 years ago, owned by an African-American collector in Savannah, Georgia. I'll spare you the whole story. But because I encountered that collection by blind good luck, that's the reason I ultimately chose to write a new full life of Douglas. But I've sort of been living with him, or he's been living with me, most of my adult life. So I'm trying to get him out of my life now, but he won't go.
First of all, again, I'd like to, this is my first visit, my wife and son, and my first visit to Martha's Vineyard. What a lovely place you have here. And I'm here with my dear friend, Dr. Patricia Sullivan, who's played such an important role in me doing this book. When I arrived at the Charleston Federal Courthouse in August of 2010, now nearly 9 years ago, I was aware there had been a legendary figure, Judge J. Wadis Waring. He had presided in 1942 to 1952 and was really the first of the great Southern civil rights judges. But he was an enigma. No one quite had figured him out, and certainly hadn't figured out what had changed him, how he had gone from this Charleston patrician to this civil rights visionary. So I set about to answer that question, and it took me on a journey that became the book, Unexampled Courage.
Thank you. So this panel, as you know, focuses on the subject of social justice. I'm wondering, when you began your projects, were you conscious of a vision of social justice that informed your work? And if so, what is or was that idea, and has it changed or did it evolve over the course of writing your books?
For me, I wrote this. My book is a short story collection, and so I wrote it over the course of probably sort of hardcore, like 5 years, especially 3 while I was at Syracuse MFA program. And gang, I was there. It's cute mob out here, yeah, squad. And so I wasn't always sure what I was making, as you're going. This kind of story, you write a story, you think it's okay, then you realize it sucks, and you write another one, you keep doing that for a while. But I did, some important things did happen to me. I've always been attracted to the work of George Saunders, and he's one of my mentors there, and his work kind of does have sort of a, I don't know if you want to call it social justice, but it's concerned with like the heart of humanity. Mm-hmm. And I also read Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo while I was there, and that is sort of decidedly concerned with, I guess, the African Americans' experience. And I had a professor who, as a prompt, actually asked us, write a story to save the world. Yeah, like no big deal. And at first I thought like, it was kind of like, I almost had like this, I don't know, like that's corny or dumb or whatever to even attempt. And as I did that, I realized that can mean so many things. And now I kind of think it's sort of defeatist not to try, actually. So in the back of my mind, that is sort of always my prompt, but at the same time, it isn't that I go from issue to issue. I think someone being themselves in the world could sort of save the world. And so I just sort of let that be sort of my lighthouse, if that makes sense. And then what comes out sort of comes out. But I don't know that I've ever made a decision, and maybe it won't be as true in my next book, but in this case at least, I didn't make a decision like, I want to tackle social issues. I never sort of decided that. It sort of kind of came with sort of, I guess, the way I was brought into like considering myself a serious author.
Well, actually, that's very moving, Nana. I mean, I don't know if I ever got that assignment.
It's my professor, Arthur Flowers, yeah.
I think I'd take up golf again. But you can't work on somebody like Frederick Douglass if you know even 2 facts about his life without it being ultimately about social justice. But as a historian, you're trying to operate on a little different measure. You're following your sources. You're trying to be a good scholar. You are a good scholar, you hope. You're trying to explain what happened and interpret it and all of that. But the central theme of my biography, or one of the handful of central themes, is simply words. And it goes right to what you just said, Nana. Douglass is all about words. He wrote millions of words, 1,200 pages of autobiography, thousands of speeches, some of them masterpieces of American oratory. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of short-form political editorials. He mastered that form in his 16 years of editing his own newspaper. He wrote one novella. Some have suggested his autobiographies are pretty good fiction as well. So he's all about words. So Douglass is a prototype for all those Americans and others who have tried to change the world with words. That's a damnable task, isn't it? How do we change the world with words?
Right.
But we're all about that. Why do we have book festivals? Why are you reading? Why are we writing? Why are we writing? That's too long a question, but how do you change the world with words? Because words were the only weapon Douglass ever had. He never held elective office. He had appointive offices. He had influence. But words were his weapon, and he became, for a variety of reasons, a master of language, a master of metaphor, a master of the King James cadences that he had in his bones and his soul. So he's an example of somebody who literally tried to change the world with words. How you measure that? I mean, you can't just find the paragraph where he changed the world. Here it is, right here. It's not that way. You have to kind of look deep and read broadly to see where that influence comes from. And the fact that we're still reading him so widely, and that people are now reciting his 4th of July speech on the 4th or 5th of July around the country, I don't know if that changed the world, but it certainly is influence. Words.
Well, when I began thinking about doing a book on Judge Waring, just to give you a brief background, he was appointed in 1942, and for the first 4 or 5 years of his judicial service, he was a moderate judge. There was nothing remarkable about his area in regard to civil rights. But beginning in 1947, he began stoutly, passionately enforcing the right of African Americans to vote, to attend, to receive equal educational opportunity. And ultimately, he wrote The Great Dissent in Briggs versus Elliott, which set forth what became Brown versus Board of Education, the rule that government-mandated segregation was per se unconstitutional, and which becomes the holding of Brown. I certainly, when I started, and I think Val's question about how you evolved is a good one here, I thought it was important to highlight the importance of the rule of law, of the upholding of the Constitution, of judicial independence. But as I evolved and learned this story better, and it was not just the story of Judge Waring, but the courage of Harry Truman in ordering the desegregation of the military and becoming the first president to put his presidency on the line for the advancement of equal rights, that it had taught me the importance of civic courage, And that is something that I think about every day, and I go around the country, I do have a lot of talks, to my judicial colleagues, and I talk to them about the importance of civic courage, of unexampled courage.
Thank you. So, thinking about these three books in relation to each other, again, that sort of are located in different moments in history, I think begs the question of how do we think about both the issues of racism and social justice as they express themselves in specific moments of time and yet persist and endure over time, so transhistorically. And then, we're also looking at these moments from this moment, right? And so I'm just wondering how you think about both the variability of these ideas and their persistence. And I feel like, Nana, because you're next to me, you feel like you have to answer first, but you don't. So,
We'll take that burden off you.
Yeah,
so
okay.
You can clean up our mess.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, let me take a shot at that. One of the lessons, I think putting these three books together was just sort of a remarkable stroke, whoever thought of that, because we are talking in some way about these really complex and troubling issues of social justice. And what the stretch of time from Douglass's birth as an enslaved person in Maryland to Nana's beautiful poetic work of fiction of the current shows us that the idea that history sort of progresses, that society progresses in a sort of positive way, making progress, one step forward, 2 steps forward, 3 steps forward, isn't what history does. So Douglass's life, he experiences emancipation, Reconstruction, equal rights, and then the loss of those rights. People say to me when I talk about the world of 1946, which I felt like I've been living in for the last 7 years, that around this period, that people say nothing's changed. Oh no, things have changed a lot. Society is by no means perfect, but there's a lot of difference between 1946 and today. But if you take the notion, because some of the issues of 1946 have been addressed, that all our problems are solved, you are sadly mistaken. And I see it every day in my courtroom. I see the results of that. And so I think one of the lessons of all this is that history swings in pendulums. And it swung throughout, back and forth in Douglass's life. He lived such an incredible life. And we saw the period during Judge Waring's service where it seemed to swing towards justice, but we've had periods of retrenchment as well.
Well, I just want to say first, if you haven't bought and read, and look, we're not just here to hawk each other's books, but we're here to hawk each other's books. Unexampled Courage is a terrific read. I reviewed it in the New York Times. I was reading my review this morning.
I couldn't have asked for anything better than what he did.
It's one of my favorite reviews I've ever written. It's easy to review a book when you really like it. But the one thing I want to say about it is, well, a couple things. First of all, you really learn from this book how much it matters whether we can trust our institutions. Law, the courts, elections, etc. Because we use the term Jim Crow segregation, Jim Crow South. It's a symbolic term. It means whatever it means in someone's head, depending on what they've been educated, how they've been educated. But in Richard's book, a book that is largely about a story of law, you nevertheless learn a lot about the brutal humiliations of Jim Crow and the violence at the core of the Jim Crow system, because it begins with the infamous blinding of Isaac Woodard, this returning veteran from the Pacific War. Anyway, we can come back to that. But the other thing, well, it's those two essentially that you learn in this book through the story of real people, and this incredible judge who just walked away from. Became a traitor to his race, his class, and also his intrepid wife. Whoa! What a character. Or character in the movie when it's made, but what an amazing woman she was to prod him along. So anyway, read it. Real quick, I mean, yeah, I'm dealing with a life that traversed most of the 19th century. Douglas is born out on the eastern shore of Maryland in a backwater of the American slave system in 1818, before the telegraph, before the railroad, before steamboats around the rivers, before the rotary press, which would revolutionize his life, before all that modernity. He's going to live all the way to 1895, and he's going to traverse the great crisis of American history, the great pivot of American history. Slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. And then, as Richard suggested, he's going to live long enough to see the great victories that were won in his 40s. He's one of those radical reformers who, they're rare, who lives to see the victory of his cause, or so it seemed. But he's going to live 30 more years, long enough to see it largely betrayed, eroding, if not being destroyed. And he finds ways to cope with all of that. The racism Douglas faced was often very distinct to the 19th century, and it was an everyday thing. He was thrown off railroad cars, physically. He was told to go eat in the kitchen at more restaurants or taverns, hotels than he could ever count. He got Jim Crowed more times than one could ever count. On the other hand, there are forms of racism that he experienced that are exactly like today, because they're rooted in the same assumptions, the same practices, the same ideas of dehumanization that sometimes police practice against young black men, that sometimes we practice institutionally, but maybe not even knowing it. There was all kinds of institutional racism in the 19th century too. Most racism was more blunt, was more direct, but there's a lot of institutional racism as well. Douglas had to learn, and so did a lot of other people, and it was never simple, ways to cope with and endure racism. In fact, I've been asked umpteen times in book talks and Q&A what surprised me about Douglas this time through. And among the many things that he surprises with is just his sheer endurance of racism. And ultimately the ways he even manufactured humor as a way of dealing with the absurdities of racism. And I can't help thinking or wondering, Nana, in the style of your prose and the style of your stories, it does seem at times you're trying to find a way in these stories to if not cope, to blunt or expose or deal with the sheer absurdity of racism. Because if you don't find the language for it, if you don't find the humor for it, if you don't find a story to put it in, what are you left with? Rage. And that often will leave you dead. So there are very specific kinds of racism I could point to about the 19th century, all kinds of them. But there are also moments when it just feels so modern, what Douglas encountered.
And it persists to this day in some ways.
Oh, yeah.
And you don't really understand it until you know the history of it.
Yeah. And I appreciate that sort of like alley-oop to me. Flawless transition.
We didn't rehearse anything.
But yeah, I think for a writer like me, it's super important to have an appreciation of history, and also to be willing to like engage with sort of extrapolating towards the future. I think it's really easy to imagine or hope that like the terrible thing or that pivotal time was on either behind you or in front of you. And I think by playing with the future, and especially but making a lot of like sort of parallels to right now, it sort of makes the reader sort of think or at least consider that sort of uncomfortable reality that, you know, right now is the time you should be doing something. Mm-hmm. You know, that right now is the time where the terrible thing that will be in someone else's textbook is happening. And there's a lot of different things I think my fiction does to make that harder to ignore. I think sometimes I just shift the kind. That is, if unarmed black people are being murdered with a gun, it's almost like familiar. It's almost like doesn't even make the news anymore. And if I say they got killed with a chainsaw, you kind of have to pause a little bit. But for me, like, you're just as dead either way. You get killed by a chainsaw or a gun. And so I'm sort of interested in playing with time that way. And the next book I do is going to be very much, these are like secret sort of, exclusive details that I haven't given out yet.
Don't tell them, right?
So everyone don't just agree to keep it. No, it's going to be very concerned with the future. And I'm actually happy to be on a panel, or at least get a chance to talk to a judge in such a low-stakes context. For once. And
Now we're in a robe here.
And you want to be up here with me, not down there.
And I'll actually about later because for me I am interested in like sort of like I don't know like that sort of a big paradigm shift. That is like we kind of continue to repeat these sort of cycles because we kind of have assumed that these institutions that haven't been there that long or that are not sort of implied are sort of implied. And I think for me I'm specifically I mentioned it earlier interested in like the case for like prison abolition. That is like maybe prisons don't exist as like wholesale the way they do now. And I think my next thing is going to be interested in that. So yeah, I'm interested in. I mean, not right. We don't have to do it right now, but like I'm interested in that kind of change. That kind of big picture paradigm shift change. And so often what I'll do in my fiction is extrapolate towards a future that to me is like on the track we're at. I can imagine this being where we go, and I often will make that imagined future pretty obviously terrible, but then I think also then you see the connection that, well, that's not that far from now. So for me, that's kind of my relationship with time.
Right.
That makes sense?
Right. Yeah, and you actually anticipated the question I wanted to ask you, but so let me just push that one level. Can you talk about the place of satire in the way that you imagine future worlds and scenarios? How does satire fit in there?
Yeah, for me, it was mentioned just a second ago, like this, you need something to make people engage. And so I often use some things that will make something seem humorous, but I kind of like that laugh, like haha, or wait, actually that's not funny. And so for me, the satire comes from sometimes just maybe a small amplification, like a chainsaw makes that killing seem satirical, but then you're like, is it though, actually? I might just change, for me, I really just change the flavor of this violence that we've seen to grow accustomed to. And I think a lot of the satire comes from the reader's sort of assumption that, wait, we're all good people. We wouldn't allow this to happen, but wait, we are actually allowing it to happen. And so I'll try to include details that make what is already there just turn it up a little bit, or just push it a little bit forward, or to me, honestly, just almost, now the gun is green or something. Just change it a little bit, and it becomes something, it becomes perverse, it becomes maybe more engaging, more interesting. It's just kind of just a trick to get us to sort of attach to that the center of what a lot of my work is, like, why are we so comfortable dehumanizing each other? And the title story in my book is called Friday Black. I spent a long time working in retail. If anybody worked in retail, I'm right here in solidarity with you. And I've literally seen people sort of, step on each other for jeans. And it's like, the first times humans trampled each other for Tickle Me Elmo, I think that should have been a big deal. And so when I make a story where now these people are literally killing each other, and there's like a section called like the bodies section for the dead bodies in the mall on Black Friday, that's like satire. But at the same time, like, people for real really do step on each other's heads to get to that TV. And so why is that okay? And then so I push on that detail to make it sort of interesting. But then I think for me, the satire, it's important to not to like act as if I'm on this hill and I'm outside of it, because I felt my personal self-worth less because I didn't have whatever Jordans before. And so and I try to think about why we buy into these systems of dehumanization. And in that case, it might be like we're buying TVs and whatever, but that guy who is on my store, if he's like a zombie and screaming or whatever, what he's really saying is like, I only have my son at Christmas, and this thing is what he really wants. And so I have to get it. And I think all American, marketing is really based on conflating things and love. And so satire makes that, I can get right to the center of that. Mm-hmm. I can say that really clearly and specifically, kind of quickly, and also have it be funny and not feel too preachy as well.
Right.
That's why we historians envy the fiction writing. Man, that sounds fun.
Yeah.
Do you have a model as a satirist? Is it Ishmael Reed or others?
I'm a big fan of George Saunders
Right.
and Ishmael Reed. For me, those are two big people. But that's who I kind of lean on a lot. And I know I'm for sure glad what you guys do is hard. If I need something, I just make it up, so. Much respect.
Some of my defendants do that.
Okay, but here's the thing. When I'm reading the books by all of you, I'm really struck by the fact that they don't fit neatly in generic categories, right? So your book is fiction, but it's very much steeped, I think, in the history of the present, and you can sort of trace that. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me, David, when you were talking about Richard's book, you talked about the character of his wife, and then you said in the movie, but in fact, both of you, I think, demonstrate a real capacity for narrative and the imagination in terms of depicting the characters at the center of your narrative, right? So they're deeply, obviously, meticulously researched in terms of historical detail, but you really captivate us and compel us with your sort of storytelling. So I'm actually wondering, I want to push that a little bit then, and ask the two of you to talk about the role of the imagination, the role of creativity in the stories that you're telling.
Well, I think developing character and characters is part and parcel of biography. I'll be curious what you think, Richard, because your book is, in great part, biography. Actually, multiple biography. I have a few models for a biography, although I never try to, put it here and try to do that. But I would read Robert Caro once in a while. I've never gotten all the way through one of Caro's books, I confess. But I love his ability to do portraiture and create scenes. And he'll spend 12 pages on a single hour in LBJ's life. I mean, I didn't do that, I hope. But he has an amazing talent for that, as do some other biographers I've loved. Creating scenes, because you're trying to create a scene and a portraiture based on what you know. You can't completely leave your sources. You don't want to do that. Ron Chernow's very good at that. Although sometimes, and Ron's a brilliant biographer, but he sometimes can go on for 2 pages on whether the guy had a high hairline, it's kind of, but which is fine, people love that. But the most important thing to me in doing that kind of mixing your sources with imagination is texture. I can't think of a better word. Little bits of information, some little piece of information that you can then use to see your way into something. I could give you a lot of examples. I'll give you one quick one. In this amazing private collection I encountered, the Walter Evans collection in Savannah, the core of which are 10 very large Douglas family scrapbooks, containing lots of family material, but also thousands of newspaper clippings. There was one little clipping, about this big, from an 1881 Rochester newspaper where Douglas had lived a long time, with a person writing a little reminiscence of having been with Frederick Douglass on election night in 1864, Lincoln's re-election, and he had been the poll worker who put Douglas's ballot in the box. Now that doesn't sound very exciting, does it? Except that the guy also told the story in this one little clipping that he walked back into the center of town late that night with Douglas, because they lived near each other, to go to the telegraph office to check out the election returns in that huge, pivotal election. And he says 4 drunken white thugs came out of an alley and challenged Douglas to go at it, called him the N-word. And he says Douglas put up his fist and said, "All right, let's have it." And according to this witness, the drunken thugs scurried back into their alley, and Douglas had what he called a political and a physical triumph. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I have one source, and I milked that baby for about 2 pages because I thought, that is so cool. On the night of Lincoln's re-election, he's staring down 4 white thugs, and I couldn't find any other source for that, but by God, I went with it. So sometimes...
You're the world's expert. Who can question you, right?
Oh,
Who's going to check him?
But there are a lot of things like that. And you must have had moments. You got a little something to go with, and it's proof's in the pudding, isn't it? Some readers might think, "Oh, come on, you don't know that," and sometimes they write you and tell you that. But you know, it's that invisible line, Valerie, isn't it? Where how far do you cross? From your sources to your storytelling, because ultimately it is a story. It's got to be a narrative story. And whenever I found myself being too didactic, get back to narrative.
Well, one of the interesting things that I know that David confronted was that Douglas had written 3 versions of his autobiography.
He's always in your way.
So he's
always in your way.
And he's got this narrative. And some of it is dead on true, some of it is fiction, some of it is a mixture, and you had to sort it out.
It's all self-protective. It's all about him.
So I had sort of a different problem. I had a story nobody knew. I didn't know the story. Nobody else did. And I was putting it together. And the story is, as David sort of alluded, that an African-American soldier, Sergeant Isaac Woodard, comes off a bus coming home literally from service of 3 years in the Pacific. And he has an encounter with a bus driver who throws him off the bus. He's arrested in a little town, beaten and blinded. And that event by the police chief of Batesburg, South Carolina, by the name of Linwood Shaw. And eventually that word filters to Harry Truman, who is so outraged by the report. It is an outrageous moment in American history. And he says, we're going to prosecute this guy, which was an impossible thing in the South. All white juries, hostile prosecutors, nobody's interested in doing it. They go through the motions, and it's a futile act seemingly. But there sat a judge who was indifferent about race until this point, and then he sees this grave injustice that just shatters his world and all his assumptions about the fairness of the system of justice to which he was administering. And he goes on this journey that ends up with Brown versus Board of Education. Now, no one had ever connected all those dots, and I had to create the narrative, weave it through this African-American sergeant, a battlefield-decorated sergeant, to the President of the United States, to a judge only a few people had ever heard of, and connect it with maybe one of the most significant moments in American history, Brown versus Board of Education. Boy, that was a challenge. How do I tell that story in a way that's credible? And, you know, David's absolutely right. You're looking for that golden piece of information that just validates your narrative and validates your thesis. And I will tell you one of them. There are many of those. You don't work as long as we all did and not stumble across many acts of serendipity. I was at a judicial meeting, and someone said to me, you need to speak to Judge Nathaniel Jones. Nate Jones was a general counsel of the NAACP, appointed by President Carter to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, where he served with distinction. He's now retired. He's in his 90s. He says, maybe he knows something about your story, because he had been a basically lifelong involvement with the NAACP. So I said to him, Judge Jones, I want to tell you, I've been working on a story in which Judge Waring summons Thurgood Marshall into his chambers privately for my lawyer's friend's ex parte communication, okay? And he says, don't bring me another segregation case. Bring me a frontal challenge to segregation. Bring me a frontal challenge. And Marshall tries to talk him out of it. And Waring persists. This is the time. This is the moment. Same question, non-as, are we in the moment? He says, this is your moment. And Marshall agrees to do it. And that begins the cases that begin Brown versus Board. So I said to Judge Jones, have you ever heard that story? He said, yeah, I know that story. I said, how do you know that story? Well, the executive secretary, the NAACP, for a period of 15 or 20 years, Walter White, most important man in the American Civil Rights Movement during the era of the 30s and 40s, largely forgotten today, into the early 50s. He says to me, Walter White told me the story. Well, Thurgood Marshall's boss tells him the story. I said, oh my God, that is incredible. He says, is your book about Judge Waring? I said, it is, but it's about this African-American soldier by the name of Isaac Woodard. He says, oh, I knew Isaac Woodard. I said, Judge Jones, how did you know Isaac Woodard? He said, well, I came back from World War II, and I was working for an African-American newspaper and called the Buckeye Review in Youngstown, where I lived. And I was told by my boss, go to your church tonight. A soldier is giving a speech named Isaac Woodard about being beaten and blinded. The NAACP is sponsoring it. He goes about a half hour early and interviews Isaac Woodard. He describes in detail to me what he was wearing. He was wearing his uniform. He had glasses. He told me who introduced him. He remembered it like it was 20 minutes before. The man is in his 90s. So I said, how do you remember this so well, Judge? He says, well, I did write a story about it at the time in my newspaper. And it just stuck with me because it was such an act of courage. And I said, and I thought about this, when I did my research at the Library of Congress and many other archives, I didn't have the time of many scholars who would sit there and write their notes down or I had brought out my iPhone and took pictures.
We do that too.
I did, just constant. I'm taking pictures. And I would organize them in notebooks. You've probably done the same thing. And that's how I did my notes. And I said, the Buckeye Review, I pull out my phone, I find Judge Jones's article from 1946 and hand it to him. Wow. He is in disbelief. Everything he had told me was exactly what was in that article in 1946. You kind of know you got the wind behind your sail on a story like that.
I think that's called truth.
That's right.
Can I say one quick thing about
It has. Well, no, actually, I've been advised that it's time for me to
Good.
take questions from the audience.
Okay.
So hold that thought. But yes, so if those of you out there who have questions would come forward to one of the mics if you are able. If not, just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. But we'd love to take a few questions from the audience at this time. Thank you.
Real quick question. Okay, has the time come to impeach Trump? Has the time come to bring impeachment proceedings against Trump?
What is it? Is it time?
Sure.
Oh, when's the time?
Yeah.
Yesterday, you know.
But
I
carefully.
have a somewhat related question, but not exactly. Not exactly the same question, but related. Okay. You've told us the importance of an independent judiciary and how brave the judges can be and how important selection of judges is for social justice. Well, over the past 2.5 years, we've had over 100 new judges appointed, including one to the Supreme Court. How can we have an independent judiciary if the judges are appointed by politicians instead of maybe the electorate?
Well, let me just first of all say that every federal judge has been appointed by a politician, right? And some of those politicians are more admirable than other politicians. They are mostly driven in the lower courts by the senators. And there is a strong culture in the judiciary. I want to give you some comfort here. I'm not going to tell you that every appointee, because it's not true for any administration, has been an ideal appointee. But there is a strong culture among my colleagues about upholding the rule of law, and not every outcome is the one I might desire, but I think in the overarching thing, I think our system will survive. And I will just say, oddly, in South Carolina, I can only speak in South Carolina, the appointees of this administration have been outstanding. I can't say that in other states because I don't know, but I will tell you that is the case in South Carolina. and it's just the local situation and who was nominated. But I'm not worried about my particular court. I think we're on the right track. And I will say, I tell you many times, my branch is the one branch that keeps working. And when they closed, and I will tell you, when they closed the government, I told my staff and the clerk, we will never close this courthouse. If we're in here by candlelight, we will never close the courthouse.
Ray of hope.
Any other questions?
Oh,
There's
okay.
one back there, yeah.
How do we fix the suppression of the vote? And how do we get the enthusiasm of the black community to come out and vote for what's right and, make their vote count? I think of, in Michigan, 87,000 black people did not vote. Trump won by 11,000. And so there was a lack of enthusiasm, obviously voter suppression and outside influence. But how do we counter that when all we have are words?
Well, we don't just have words. I'll take the suppression question real quickly. First and foremost, see the documentary that's on Amazon Prime called Rigged. It's just come on in the last couple of weeks. Check it out. It's a serious documentary that had a good deal of money behind it. They have exposed voter suppression for what it is. They got lots of Republicans on camera essentially admitting what they're doing. The first thing we have to do with voter suppression is put it right. It's called Rigged, R-I-G-G-E-D. That's the title of the documentary. I think it's an hour and a half, Amazon Prime. Anyway, the first thing we have to do is move voter suppression right to the top of the agenda, maybe just after climate change or close to it, and healthcare and whatever else is at the top. Because what we have now in America is a democracy in which one party does everything it can to stop the votes of people who are brown, black, young, and old who vote for the other party. It's absolutely transparent what they've been doing for 10 years. The evidence is all over the place. So we've got to find a way to make this a consensus understanding in America that it's even happening. There's so much voter suppression denial, just like there is climate change denial. We've got to get this issue right to the top and look at the ways this is being done. Because it's being done in lots of states and not just southern states. Wisconsin's one of the worst. So that's the first thing we have to do. And we've got to remember that this is something you can go back to Douglas on. He thought all rights began with the right to vote. Now, he might have sometimes overemphasized that. But Douglas thought if you don't have the vote, you don't have anything else.
And I just want to echo everything about the voter suppression, but I also think it's important to consider when we want the primary victims of any particular in this case we're talking about voter suppression and the black community, the primary victims of any particular cause, I guess, or any particular situation, to be also like the saviors of it. It's interesting that that's like the way we think of it, and I mean, and you could like sort of think about it in various issues where you want, women and whether it be the queer community and black people to like always be the saviors of society, and I think that's also like a problem that we have to think about as well.
I agree. Yes. So I recognize we are almost out of time. We have two more questions. I'm going to ask each of you to ask your questions so we get them both out there, and then the panelists can respond as appropriate. So, okay, Joe.
Good. I could only ask this to David because that's the only book I have read. But it might be true for both of the biographers. David, when you as a male are writing about a male, how did you manage to also write as imaginatively as you could about the women in Douglas's life? Because I found that very interesting in your book.
Hold it, David. Let me get this
Okay,
question
sorry,
as well.
sorry.
Okay.
I
Thank you.
just had a question about, I think after the 2016 election, a lot of people in this country felt that the judiciary was going to kind of protect us. But given the role of the judiciary in the mass incarceration of brown people in this country, and the power of the prosecutors in this country, I have some real doubts about this third branch of government that I think really need to be addressed on an institutional level, but also because I think it has really been the source of mass racism in this country.
Let me address
Thank
that
you.
because I think it's a very fair question. We are 5% of the world's population and have 25% of the prisoners. That's a problem. Okay, that is a problem. And it is, for comfort for some, it is the subject for which my colleagues and I constantly discuss in every meeting. It is a source of great concern. And one thing that I have attempted to do was to ask in each case, not incarceration as the first resort, which is the sentencing guidelines, frankly, tend in that direction, the United States sentencing guidelines, but to be the last resort. What are our alternatives? And I consider that in every case. My colleagues discuss that and try to do that in every case. There is a movement in the judiciary, federal judiciary, away from the mass incarceration movement. Over 50% of the sentences are below the sentencing guidelines right now, and the trending continues in that direction. But I know there's a lot of focus on the federal judiciary. We represent about 8% of the United States prisoners. It's the states where most of these lengthy sentences are occurring. And I speak to state judges about this, about the issue of mass incarceration. And we got to realize that there are a series of decisions made from the point of stopping someone to question them, to the point of arrest, to the point of whether you're going to prosecute, to the point of pretrial diversion, to the point of the decision not to plea bargain and to allow them to plead to a non-incarceration sentence. There's a series of decisions. And I cannot say in any case, I know you made that decision, prosecutor or police officer, because of the race of the person. You can't prove it on an individual case. But it is apparent to me that most of the people standing before me are people of color. It's inescapable. And I keep reminding the prosecutors every time I can. For instance, they bring me people who are here illegally, and they're prosecuting them, want me to incarcerate them. And that all I say to them, where do you work? And they say, well, I work in a landscape company or a construction company. I say, when are you going to bring me one of those employers? Right? I mean, when are you going to do that? So I think it is something important to talk about. I think we need to talk about it candidly. The result speaks for itself. And we've got to spend a lot of time talking about how we keep pushing brown and black people through the system so they end up in front of me pleading guilty and looking at a period of incarceration. That's not to say that we do not need to incarcerate some people. Some people are genuinely dangerous. We need them to protect ourselves. But I'm sorry, let me just finish. Okay. Very good. I'll be glad to talk about this later. More.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.